If you're a Ferrari fan that started watching in the early 2000s or just a little bit later on, this era might be the worst in your Ferrari supporting life. But what if I was to tell you that it's not actually the worst it could possibly be? Now, I've said in previous videos that the days of Lauda and Schumacher were the exception, not the norm, and Ferrari fans long for those successful days of dominance once again. And every time it looks like Ferrari might do well, as they did in testing earlier this year and even towards the end of last year, it all ends in disappointment. Like Warsaw's season did. Arseholes. The only flash of a return to some sort of form came at the Chinese Grand Prix of 2025, when new Ferrari marquee signing Lewis Hamilton won the sprint race, only for the cars to go backwards in race trim, and then both of them got disqualified come the end. Hamilton for illegal skid block wear, while the other car, Charles Leclerc, was disqualified for being underweight. Then there's the memes of "it must be the water," or questions being answered with something that had nothing to do with the original question asked by the driver, and the memes that Ferrari does strategy simply by rolling dice. Then there's the other joke of "make Ferrari Benetton again," because that's almost how Ferrari hit their peak in the early 2000s. Schumacher went over at the end of 1995, and by the start of the 1997 season, he was joined by Rory Byrne, Ross Brawn, and a couple of other key technical staff. With Nigel Stepney whipping the pit crew into shape, Ferrari almost won the 1997, 1998, and 1999 season, coming close on all three occasions, but losing out right at the death. But then, in 2000, they were back. The first Drivers' Championship since 1979. It concluded an era in Ferrari's Formula 1 history that I call the banter years, a period where they were more likely to be fighting against Ligier, Jordan, LaRue and teams like that, instead of the likes of Senna, Prost, Mansell and so on and so forth. But during 1994, this barren spell, which was the worst in Ferrari's history at that point, finally came to an end. The story of Jean Todt arriving at Maranello has been documented already on the channel. Todt won Le Mans on the Sunday and was working at Maranello on the Monday, as the story goes, as he and Luca de Montezemolo were working out some big brain scheme to get Todt over to Ferrari and start working the same magic in Italy as he'd done with Peugeot in the 1980s. Peugeot was in trouble before Todt arrived, but the 205, along with the Peugeot rally team in the Group B era of competition having success, increased sales. Now the 205 GTI is a sought after car, and the four-wheel drive, mid-engine, turbocharged monsters that are road-legal 205 T16s are reaching six figures on the auction market. The thinking was, Todt had saved Peugeot through the rally program, so there was every chance that he could do the same with Ferrari and rescue their reputation. This was, after all, the oldest and now most successful team on the grid, having taken the statistic off Lotus in 1983 when they won their 8th Constructors' title. Ferrari has 16 Constructors' Championships in total. Behind them are McLaren and Williams, who are tied on 9 each. Although, if you're watching this later on into 2025 or even into early 2026, McLaren now has 10 Constructors' titles. Todt had walked into Ferrari mid-season in 1993 to see that the car was, well, a bit rubbish. Ferrari had been trying to get on par with Williams and McLaren in what I refer to as the digital era, the 2 years spanning 1992 and 1993, where the team scrambled to slap as many electronic gizmos on the cars that they could. Now, if you want more information, videos on the McLaren MP48 and Williams active suspension years have already been done, with the digital era sitting in this little sub-era, if you want to call it that, within the 3.5 litre era that ended at the end of 1994. Ferrari had made a complete hash of things. The active suspension system was buggy and didn't work anywhere near as well as the offerings from other teams. While Williams could set theirs up to work automatically based off how far from the corners they were, thanks to the brains of Paddy Lowe, the Ferrari system needed a bit more jiggery-pokery to get it to work properly, and then needed to be reset as the car went over the line. Because the Ferrari ran reverse rake on the active suspension in a straight line, the bottom of the car was too close to the ground. This caused Berger to wipe out, exiting the pits at Estoril. In short, between the active suspension playing up and the car in general being an absolute dog, Ferrari needed to throw that car in the bin and start fresh for 1994. With the active cars being banned for that year, it meant that Ferrari should be able to get back to building a more traditional racing car easier than the likes of Williams, who had seen their heads buried in computer code since the tail end of 1991. Although Ferrari was not helped in the slightest because the designer of the 1993 car, Jean-Claude Migeot, had been sacked during the season and hadn't really told anybody how this car was designed. So whoever took over must have felt like my mate Devin did when he was looking at the code for R-Factor 2 when Studio 397 took over from ISI. Basically going, what the hell is this? Ferrari also had this toxic culture of nobody accepting responsibility for, well, anything. The engine department wouldn't admit that the engine was rubbish. At the same time, the design department wouldn't accept that the car had the aerodynamic properties of Jabba the Hutt, and John Barnard, who had been roped in to fix the car, wasn't allowed to because he had to work on the active suspension instead. Again, Schumacher and Lauda were the exceptions. This really was peak banter era Ferrari. But Barnard was eventually allowed to put his pencil to paper and had been working on the new 1994 car in the background. This was also the first Ferrari to be designed out of Barnard's Guildford Technical Office, the name chosen because it spelled out GTO, his favourite Ferrari. Barnard had actually returned to Ferrari after a brief spell at Benetton, and in the terms and conditions of his contract he'd asked, once again, to be able to work out of England instead of Italy, which didn't exactly make him popular. But with how scathing the Italian press can be about Ferrari performances, he felt that it was better for him that way. Bloody Italian bias. The car had several notable changes in between 1993 and 1994. The first is the nose cone, which was now higher up than it was in 1993, which was part of an aero revolution that was happening at the time. While some of the teams, most notably Williams, Ligier and McLaren, were still using 1992 style noses, the likes of Benetton had shifted to having a nose that was higher up, as it was believed that you could get more air under the car that way and produce more underbody downforce, as well as exploiting the entirety of the front wing instead of having that, well, nose in the way. It was something that Tyrrell had kicked off a few years before, and I've done a full video on those raised noses if you're interested. The nose of the Ferrari was like that of the Benetton. It wasn't as high as the Benetton's, but still higher than it had been, and was smoothed off and rounded to better help with the aerodynamic properties of the car. The other difference that sticks out is the side pods. The ones on the F93A were boxy and mostly straight lines, while the 1994 ones were more sculpted. Instead of having almost rectangular boxes stuck on the sides, the inlets were angled and more arrow-like to once again assist with the aero, with the boxy inlets rounded off to provide something that was nudging towards what Schumacher would have in the second half of 1996. It was certainly a much more aerodynamic looking car, and most of you watching might say it's better looking overall. Meanwhile, in the back, a massive noise generator was plugged in. Ferrari was sticking to their guns and keeping the V12 in the back. The 1994 regulations had allowed for refueling again, something that Ferrari had heavily pushed for since it allowed them to keep on using V12s without having to worry about running out of fuel during a Grand Prix, because now they could just put more in. Ferrari had initially used something similar to the 1993 engine for the first few rounds, but debuted a brand new engine for qualifying only from San Marino onwards. The newer Tipo 043 3.5 litre V12 was designed by Osamu Goto, the man who had been the brains behind Honda's V12 that Senna won the World Championship with in 1991, and his partner for the project was Claudio Lombardi. Goto and Lombardi had built this new engine from scratch, building it almost in the way that Honda had a few years ago, by having a wider V-angle of 75 degrees and having a shorter stroke. It was so much like the Honda that Goto wrote a letter to his old mates in Japan saying that he might as well stick a giant H on it. The Tipo 041 that had been used in 1993 and then brought over into 1994 still had around 750 horsepower or so, down on the offerings from Renault, but still pretty competitive. It was competitive when it could actually be competitive. The Ferrari suffered early doors from a bit of a handling problem that was caused in part by that hefty V12 behind Alesi and Berger's heads. Because of the extra weight that V12s brought with them, it wasn't as nimble as the offerings from Benetton, Williams, Ligier and McLaren due to it needing to be a little bit longer, and also needing a larger fuel tank because of the drinking problem that the V12 had. While the engine was powerful and great for all things straight line, the way it was packaged and the overall weight meant that it wasn't changing direction as fast. Even though it wasn't as nimble, it still had a little bit of a problem with balance, as Alesi found out when he crashed his car in a massive way while testing at Mugello. Alesi, who had finished third at Brazil in the opening round of the season, lost the rear of his car at the Arrabiata corner and slammed into a wall, compressing the vertebra in his neck and getting a concussion. In his place, Nicola Larini was called in for the next 2 rounds, taking the Frenchman's place for Aidan and that fateful weekend at Imola. Larini didn't have the best of races at Aidan. He was part of the first corner melee where Hakkinen tagged Senna, and as Larini arrived, he punted the stricken Williams, and took them both out before the first half a mile or so had been completed. That said though, Berger in the other Ferrari finished second, which made it 2 podiums from 2 for the Ferrari drivers, as Alesi had finished third in Brazil. It also meant that Ferrari were 2/3 of the way to matching their 1993 podium tally after just 2 rounds. Larini would get the only podium of his career at Imola, finishing on the same podium as Michael Schumacher and Mika Hakkinen, although that race in general is one that a lot of people will just want to forget. But for Ferrari, progress was being made. 3 races into 1994, and they'd equalled the 1993 podium tally. Where else was this car going to take them? Alesi returned for Monaco, finishing 5th, while Berger took the 4th podium for Ferrari in as many races, at a track where the Ferrari should not have done well because of that massive engine in the back. A retirement came for Berger at Spain with Alesi 4th, but yet another podium for Ferrari came in Canada, and another in France, and Silverstone. But at the German Grand Prix, breakthrough. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say that the old Hockenheim was the power track, essentially an oval punctuated by 3 chicanes with a little bit of a twiddly bit towards the end. With the cars set up for so little downforce, they were happy to just crawl through the stadium section because all the time was made up on the straights. A track that even back then, they were easily getting over 210 miles an hour. Shall I wait a moment for you to start typing about how much better the old Hockenheim was and how it was butchered and how it's not the same anymore and they need to bring it back? Well, I'll save you the hassle, because the old track wasn't that good. It was pretty dull. And part of the reason it was butchered is because it was simply too long, and the stadium section attendees could be waiting up to about 2 minutes for the cars to come round again. There was also the security breaches that had been exposed in the early 2000s with the ex-Mercedes employee that made his way out onto the track, and there were also concerns about the rising speeds potentially resulting in a Mark Webber Valencia type of situation. It had to be done, as much as nostalgia will try to tell you otherwise. This new engine, the Tipo 043, was the most powerful V12 slapped into the back of an F1 car. 800 plus horsepower was the output, and when it comes to V12 F1 cars, people say that this is the best sounding of the lot. In fact, the Wikipedia page that I'm grabbing the car's stats off does say that the 412 T1 was popular for its noise. But it wasn't just the engine that had changed, because Ferrari had made changes to the overall car over time. Some of the changes were to do with the knee-jerk safety stuff that the FIA imposed, like the changes to the wings and the holes cut into the airbox. But Ferrari made some changes that they wanted to make. This led to the 412 T1B, which had a lower nose and larger sidepod intakes, and that led to the 412 T2 that ran in 1995, the last V12 F1 car in history. The new engine and the changes to the car did something right because Berger and Alesi locked out the front row of the grid, both of them out-qualifying the Williams of Damon Hill. Schumacher's V8 Benetton was off the pace while the whole field was separated by 5.5 seconds. The downside is, 11 of the cars on the qualifying sheet wouldn't make the first corner. Why? Because Hakkinen happened. Yeah, it wasn't pretty. But it was to get worse, because this is the race where Jos Verstappen went up in flames in a botched pit stop, resulting in him and several other people being caught in the blaze. Alesi, meanwhile, didn't make the end of the first lap because of typical Italian electrics. Only 8 people would finish the race. But either way, Berger won the race, taking the win by nearly 55 seconds, just over half a lap on that old circuit, with the 2 Ligiers surviving long enough to take second and third. After the 1992 season that caused Ivan Capelli to basically quit Formula 1 and a 1993 season full of issues, it looked like Ferrari was back. Something we see every single year these days. Next year will be your year, I promise. After not scoring a win through 1991, 1992 and 1993, Ferrari was back on the top step. The next job was getting there more often. About that. Alesi failed to finish the next 4 races following Hockenheim. His gearbox went in Hungary, he had an air pressure problem at Spa, the gearbox went again at Monza, and was then involved in a collision at Estoril where he collided with David Brabham's Simtek while trying to lap him. Berger wasn't faring much better. His win became 12th at Hungary, having an air pressure problem there too, and then suffered the same retirement again in Belgium. His gearbox went at Estoril before losing the engine in the pouring rain at Suzuka. But in the middle of all this, Berger was 2nd at Monza. He was 5th at Jerez and 2nd in Australia. All added up, Berger was 3rd in the standings for the drivers, and Ferrari finished 3rd in the constructors behind Williams and Benetton. So all of this should have carried on into 1995 then, right? Well, not exactly, because the engine regulations changed for 1995 and some of the advantages that a V12 would have had suddenly went away. Basically, these regulations would make the V12s redundant. The engines were shrunk from 3.5 litres to 3 litres, and apparently the power advantages of the V12 that they'd been able to get from the larger displacement were no longer there. At the same time, V10s had now been proven to be lighter, smaller, more efficient, and offered the best all-round advantages. They were that happy middle ground between fuel efficiency and power, and Renault were able to build more powerful engines as well as more reliable engines with 2 fewer cylinders. So Ferrari, reluctantly, had to join the rest of the world in the 1990s. But V12s were not officially banned until the early 2000s. It was all set out in the Concord Agreement that the engines must be V10s, which was labelled as cost-cutting, but at the same time, it kept the grid fillers happy for a bit. It also stopped Toyota developing their own V12, which might actually have been a good thing, because the last V12 in F1 being a Toyota rather than a Ferrari, that would not have gone down well, would it? As it was, Ferrari had one last hurrah with the V12 in 1995, before settling with V10s. But the 1994 Ferrari 412 T1 is one of the last of a dying breed, an era before full-up computer design came along. It was an era where the cars were largely still designed with a pencil and paper, and in the final years before the race cockpit size and everything else, all 3 iterations of the 412T, so that being the T1, T1B and T2, were, as described by Spannerhead.com, completely stunning. Spannerhead.com then went on to say that the 412T1 was the swan song of a properly organic Ferrari. And with the noise that that V12 engine made, it's a Ferrari that's considered by Ferrari fans to be one of the greatest ever built, even if it was outperformed by the Benetton and Williams cars for 2 straight years. So then, a look at the 1994 Ferrari 312 T1, one of the last of a dying breed. If this has been a fun look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know a good job was done, and for more like this from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads over at Patreon who continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here as well as help with the picture purchasing piggy bank, a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, the super thanks for the one and done donations and memberships so you can do Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.